Stimulus package and its impact on jobs. Joining me is Dr. Steve Agee, economics professor at Oklahoma City University, and Steve Anderson from the Oklahoma Council of Public Affairs. Gentlemen, new unemployment numbers are going to come out here in just a few minutes, expected to increase nationally to 10.1. Is this stimulus package working when it comes to jobs? Let's start with you.
Well, I think in some respects it is. I think that what we need to do is look at this year and next year in addition, because only a portion of the stimulus has actually been spent. About 50% of it's designed to be spent this year in 2010. So we haven't worked through all of the stimulus yet, and I think there's still, something to examine as we go forward. It was designed to be a 3-year package, so there's still a lot to be learned from the effects of the stimulus.
Steve Anderson?
Well, let's look at what's really happened so far. That, for example, the $300 million in the stimulus that went to education that's already been spent last year. If you look at where that money went, $90 million of it went to pay increases and benefit increases on the K through 12 side. And you look at the fact that it's being financed with interest. Just remember, there's interest payments that are accumulating on this too. And I think really instructive in this is there were just 56 jobs created in education last year in the state, and just a few jobs in government. The greatest job growth was in the tribal governments. So if one wants to argue that tax incentives matter because the tribes have some advantages when it comes to taxes, and that the free market works, let's look at where the real job growth was in this state.
Let's talk about in more general terms. What is the government's role during economic downturns? Stimulate job growth directly by creating government jobs, or stimulate growth indirectly by giving tax breaks and other incentives to private business? Start with Steve Anderson.
Well, I think you know where I'm going to stand on that. I think if you'd have just taken that $1 trillion, given tax breaks to small business, we would have seen some economic growth, and we wouldn't have the interest payments that are accumulating right now on our children and grandchildren.
Dr. Agee?
Well, I do think that there's a mix. I do think that a portion, as Steve knows, of the stimulus was tax cuts. About a third of the $787 billion was designed in terms of tax cuts that individuals received. The other went for education, transportation, commerce. I think you're seeing both sides. Private industries benefiting. We've got to realize that we had a huge contraction in the economy. We had slack demand. Government has stepped in here in the breach to fill some of that slack demand over this period, hoping that this economy recovers. And when it does, when consumers come back in as the main demanders in the economy, government needs to back away and let the consumer and the private sector take back over.
I know we're not supposed to look at one-day snapshots, but yesterday the Dow went down more than 200 points, more than 2%, all the indices. Based on the new claims for unemployment went up 8,000, thought it was going to go down 10,000. But the other thing, the debt of countries in the European Union, this is debt spending that we're doing with the stimulus package. So are we looking at trouble from that standpoint, from an economic standpoint?
I think there's still concern. There's still a lot of weakness in the economy. That's one reason the Federal Reserve, and of course I sit as a chairman of the Federal Reserve here in Oklahoma City, there's a lot of weakness. We're trying to keep interest rates low to maintain liquidity in the economy. As Steve knows, we've had a credit crunch over the last 18 months. That has been somewhat eliminated, not entirely, but there's still concern on the part of the Fed that we're going to have some difficulties, we're going to have some financial pressures. We need to keep liquidity in the system to avoid these kind of problems going forward.
Steve Anderson?
Well, I think it's interesting when I hear the representatives in Washington say, well, it would have been worse if we wouldn't have put it. Reminds me a lot of that story of the cheating spouse caught with his lover, who turns and says, well, you're going to believe me or your lying eyes. I think when we look at the reality of what's happened, I think this was money that was poured down a rat hole, so to speak. I think had we put it back, all of it, into tax cuts, and most of those tax cuts you're talking about were not targeted to small business. They ended up being basically a type of welfare, the stimulus payments we sent out to each person on a per capita basis. I don't think incentivize things the way that a true tax cut for small business would have.
All right, Steve Anderson, Oklahoma Council of Public Affairs. Dr. Steve Agee, economics professor at Oklahoma City University. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here and trying to help us sort this thing out. It's 22 minutes past 6 o'clock. More still.